According to Statistics Canada 2011 household survey, 16.6% of Canada's Christians are immigrants. But the idea of a multicultural church can almost seem like an anomaly. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was once quoted as saying, "It is appalling that the most segregated hour of Christian America is 11 o'clock on Sunday morning," commenting on the fact that many churches in North America can sometimes reflect one group of people and not be as diverse as their neighborhood and society surrounding them. But there is one church in Scarborough, Ontario, that has been able to achieve that. Noted as one of the most multicultural churches in the Greater Toronto Area, if not Ontario, Morningstar Fellowship has over 1,200 members representing many diverse cultures. Pastors Robert MacGregor, Dennis Campbell, and Jack Chen join us today. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So you did something radical a number of years ago. You opened your church doors and allowed your community in. You saw that there needed to be a shift. Tell me about that.
Okay. Go ahead, Jack.
Well, I think it started with the leadership deciding that they wanted to open the doors of their church to better reflect their neighborhood. And so it began with their recruitment of a pastor who, even though he was originally one of their own young people, but he had gone away to the Philippines for 10 years as a missionary and came back with a vision and a burden. Although the vision was there, but they needed a catalyst person. And so John Mahaffey was brought on in 1990, and he got the ball rolling.
Wow. So Dennis, tell me about what the church looked like before this pastor decided to change things.
Well, the church was predominantly white, having moved from a predominantly white neighborhood into our current location. And so there were a few blacks, perhaps even, I guess, maybe a smattering of Filipinos, Jack. But beyond that, it was predominantly white church when it moved into 7601 Shepherd Avenue in the Malvern area. And after it arrived, the neighborhood changed because the government decided to move immigrants who were beginning to flood into the Toronto area, to move them a little bit further east, right into this community.
Wow.
And so the church, unbeknownst, had come into a community that within a matter of years was now very much multicultural, didn't look like their church. So they were faced with this issue of what do we do?
Yeah. So Bob, the decision then and a conscious decision to say we're going to try to reflect that community because, as Jack said, it was a very Caucasian church. Tell me about that process and making that decision.
Well, I think it's theologically driven. It's not just a practical matter, but the scriptures require a church to be mindful of the nations. Jesus said, make disciples of all nations, and if the nations are in your backyard, you need to have a good answer if you don't have all the nations. The prophet Isaiah prophesied to the Jews that there be coming a day when your monopoly on the people of God, your language, would stop, and that you would be hearing people with different languages and different tongues, almost as an indictment on the Jewish people. And so when the gospel became international, the churches began to hear their scriptures being spoken of in all these different languages, and it created some hassle, but God said, this is the way it is, get used to it. And so we're driven theologically to make that move, and it's not an easy thing. There's all kinds of barriers, but it's the right thing to do.
So what was the reaction of the church when you decided to make this conscious choice? Jack?
I think the reactions were very varied.
Yeah.
Some people loved it. They opened their arms and started to embrace the new people's groups that were coming into the church. Some were a little uncomfortable, and so I think some of those left, but not too many. Praise God for that. But over the years, I think I've been with the church since 1994, and we've seen a huge transition.
So tell me about how culturally, you talked about culture. Now that you have 1,200 people in your church, do you shift to one culture more than the other? How do you bring in all these people from all over the world? Because church is a part of culture. It's a part of, what we see every day. Dennis?
Yeah, we actually had a bit of a conversation about that to the three of us on our way up. And one of the things that I said was, you know, while we very much want to appreciate who we are in terms of our diversity, there is a unity about us in that we're one in Christ, but we do not suppress our differences. And so what we have done over the years is that we've allowed individual groups within our church to express their cultural differences, but not to become a church that's uniform. And so there's a richness in our diversity, but does not overpower our unity or vice versa. And so that's what we have attempted to do. And I think we've been fairly successful in doing that. In that again, this is just who we are as a church that's very much diverse, but don't feel like we have to be one particular group at any one particular time. We are just expressing that however we sense the Spirit of God leads us at that particular time to do so.
Your pastoral team also reflects different.
Glad you noticed.
Here, as well as all the pastors that you've left behind. You know, different ethnicities as well. Tell us about that choice, because you could have just chosen to have one pastor, or, you know, why?
Yeah, no, again, that was part of the deal. I came 2 years later after Jack. I came in '96. And obviously I didn't know this until after I showed up, but there was an intentional getting a black pastor. There were folks in our church that said, well, wait a minute, there are enough of us in terms of us being black that we need to represent. We need to have a representation on our leadership team as well. And so there was this intent to bring me on as a black pastor. But when I showed up, I did not become a pastor to blacks. Again, that's the unique and the beauty of us, is that I'm a pastor to the entire church. But our leadership definitely intentionally wanted to reflect who we are. And so we've got a Filipino pastor as well. And so we are, and it's a beautiful thing to see that.
And we just hired a Hawaiian.
That's right, we did, didn't we?
Look at that. Yes. Talk to us about the pros and cons of having a very multicultural church. Because I could see maybe some people maybe going to Dennis because he is black and I'm black, and so I'll go to, you know. So talk about the pros and cons of that, Bob.
I think the pros are what Paul said in Ephesians 3, that the church is called to be the manifold wisdom of God, a demonstration of something wonderful about God that you wouldn't see anywhere else. So in the church, you see people whose ethnicities would naturally drive them apart, as we see in the world, but in the church, there's something powerful that binds them together. And I think that's an exciting adornment of the gospel. When we preach the gospel, we can show people, this is what it does. Look around you. Back home, these people are fighting. But in the church, there's a unity, and it's just a lot easier to preach when you've got that visual reminder.
So you're saying there are no cons? Is that what you're saying?
You know, I'm not really mindful of the cons. I mean, all right, so I've burnt my mouth on some hot chili or something, or some jerk chicken every once in a while, but I can put up with that.
One thing that you talked about, Bob, with us is just, again, the diversity and even clothing. You know, you're able to celebrate different cultures. Tell us about the beauty in that, as well as being, you know, being able to celebrate just how diverse we are. Jack?
Well, up until a few years ago, we had a biennial event known as World Fest. And that would attract all the people from our neighborhoods, including our counselor, who would make sure to be there because he got to meet all the peoples of his community that he was representing. And he had to come to our church to meet them. Okay? And we would take account of the different nationalities involved in it, because we would adorn the hall with the flags of their countries. And we have a count of about 72 different nationalities in our church today.
72?
72, yes.
Wow, that's amazing. So, you know, if we have a pastor watching that's saying, you know, my church is predominantly one culture, how do I do this? How do I, you know, open my doors and embrace our country?
A pastor in Toronto or a pastor in...
Anywhere. We're a national show. How do we embrace more? Is that a challenge that you think is a good challenge for most churches to take?
I think I heard Bob say something about, you know, people are coming into our backyards. How about moving them into our church? Okay,
I think
we
it's
just
really
need to be conscious.
important. I talked with one Jamaican in our church because I just was doing a little bit of homework for this segment, and I said to he's our board chairman. I said, Dean, how am I going to answer this question about the multicultural church? How does Morningstar appeal to you as a new Canadian? And he said when he came into the church for the very first time as a newcomer, somewhat insecure, although he's a giant, when he saw leadership that represented the cultures, it immediately comforted him. So I think something that needs to be done, like Dennis has said, is make sure that you invite the nations into your leadership. And you get that in Acts 6 when the early church was struggling with the Hellenists as opposed to the traditionalists. The apostles made a very wise decision. They said, okay, let's allow or insist that these newcomers enter into leadership. And so you've got the beginning of the diaconate, which was basically led by newcomers to the faith, or outsiders, or people who were more Greek in their orientation. And I think that's important for leadership to do that, bring people into the inner circle.
Yeah. And also I think it just shows exactly what you said, us as Christians being more inclusive and allowing others to come in. We only have a few minutes left. How have you seen, you talked about that story of that gentleman, how have you seen people just change? And I wonder too about the original church and maybe, those original members. How have you seen them change when those doors are open and they're seeing how their church is transforming? You have multiple services now. I mean, the church is growing. Tell me about that, Jack.
I think participation at different levels and different forums are important, and how you design them, how you craft them. One of the very vital areas of our life is the small groups area. And we have small groups. We have almost 40 small groups right now. And they have people from every nationality. And we were just talking about that on the way here. And you could go into one of our small groups and feel totally at home with the people from the Caribbean area. Or you could go into a small group with the Filipinos, and boy, they know how to party. Okay? Or you could go into a group, and we don't have too many of those that are predominantly one race, and you could still feel at home. And that's one of the areas where I think people have learned to appreciate each other, because you let your guard down, there are no pretenses, and you get to love each other as a fellow brother and sister in the Lord.
Yeah, and there's always a bit of apprehension.
Of course.
When you're talking about differences, there's always the threat of misunderstanding. And so there was that originally when our church began to transition to being a multicultural church. There were people who went, but they began to realize as time went on that there was nothing here really to be afraid of. But in fact, this was much more what God intends, that our churches be what the nations are. That's going to be our future as the people of God. And so over time, lots of folks who perhaps originally would not have been in favor of this saw the beauty of having these diverse ethnic groups in our church and the richness that brings to us. It just makes us a better church.
Well said, well said. Thank you, gentlemen. Bob, Dennis, Jack, for joining us. I think Morningstar is the perfect example of what you can do when you're conscious about allowing. You're outside, allowing your neighborhood. I will. Yes. I will, allowing your neighborhood in. Yeah. Thanks again, guys.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.